For a single dollar, the city had sold her the one thing no one else wanted: a rusted, forgotten lighthouse. But inside its lamp room, behind a wall of corroded iron, was a vault containing not a light, but a fortune beyond imagining, and a legacy that would demand everything from her. This is a story about what we inherit and what we owe. Before we go any further, if you love stories that explore the hidden depths of family and fortune, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let the storm begin. The single-dollar bill was worn soft as cloth, a fragile ghost of currency folded into a sharp, determined square in Alani's pocket. It was the last dollar she owned that wasn't already allocated to the quarter tank of gas in her rattling sedan or the half-eaten box of crackers on the passenger seat. Beside her, strapped into their car seats, her 5-year-old twins, Kai and Luna, were asleep, their small faces serene in the pale, indifferent light of the municipal office. They were oblivious to the fact that their world had shrunk to the worn upholstery of this car, their address now a transient space between parking lots and side streets. The city's derelict property program was an act of bureaucratic desperation, a way to offload crumbling liabilities onto the shoulders of the hopeful or the foolish. For $1 you could buy a condemned house, a boarded-up storefront, or, in this case, the Solitude Point Lighthouse. The listing was a joke to most, a single grainy photo of a rust-streaked cylinder of iron and brick clinging to a wind-scoured bluff 2 hours from anywhere. To Alani, it was the only option that didn't end in a shelter. The clerk, a woman named Carol with weary eyes and a practiced air of disinterest, had slid the single sheet of paper across the counter. "You understand this is sold as is, ma'am," she'd said, her voice a monotone drone. "As is includes, but is not limited to, structural instability, lack of utilities, environmental hazards, and general uninhabitability." Alani had just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Uninhabitability was a relative term when your alternative was a 2008 sedan in the middle of a November chill. She signed the papers, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. She slid the folded dollar bill through the slot in the glass partition. Carol took it, stamped the deed with a heavy, final thud, and pushed a single enormous iron key across the counter. It was black with age, pitted and heavy, more like a weapon than an instrument of access. Felt like an anchor. "It's yours," Carol said, already turning to the next file, her part in the absurd transaction complete. Now, driving the winding coastal highway, the sky the color of slate and the ocean a churning, restless gray, the weight of that key felt like it was pressing the entire car to the asphalt. The twins murmured in their sleep. Luna's hand was curled around the ear of a threadbare stuffed rabbit. Kai's brow was furrowed as if in a dream of great consequence. They were the reason for this madness. Their resilience was both her inspiration and her shame. They had adapted to life in the car with a child's simple acceptance, turning the back seat into a fort, a spaceship, a castle. They didn't know they were homeless. They only knew they were with her. The turnoff was an unmarked dirt road that quickly devolved into a rutted track. The car bucked and groaned, its suspension crying out in protest. The air grew thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. And then she saw it. The lighthouse wasn't just on the bluff. It was the bluff. It rose from the rock as if it had grown there, a colossal, forgotten sentinel against the bruised sky. The rust wasn't just a stain. It was a skin of deep, angry orange that bled down its iron plates in weeping streaks. The windows of the keeper's house attached to its base were boarded over, the wood gray and splintered. The wind, a constant, living presence here, shrieked around the lantern gallery, a sound of profound and unending loneliness. Alani pulled the car to a stop where the track dissolved into weeds and rock. For a long moment, she just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, the sound of the wind and the crashing waves filling the silence. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile armor of her hope. This wasn't a home. It was a ruin, a tomb. What had she done? She had traded her last dollar not for a shelter, but for a monument to decay. She looked in the rearview mirror at her children. They were beginning to stir, their dream state disturbed by the cessation of movement. She had to be strong for them. She had to make this work. Taking a deep breath that tasted of salt and impending rain, she got out of the car. The wind hit her with physical force, whipping her hair across her face and chilling her to the bone. She walked toward the massive wooden door at the base of the structure, the iron key clutched in her hand. The wood was swollen and warped, a line of green moss growing in the deep cracks. The keyhole was a dark, corroded maw. It took both her hands and all her strength to force the key into the lock. It grated, resisted, then turned with a deafening series of clicks that echoed like gunshots in the vast emptiness of the coast. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It scraped against a stone floor, opening just enough for her to slip through into the darkness within. The air inside was thick and cold, carrying the scent of a century of damp stone, salt rot, and profound stillness. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed away from the world, a place that had been waiting. The darkness inside the lighthouse was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to absorb the thin gray light filtering through the crack of the open door. Alani stood just inside the threshold, her eyes struggling to adjust, her senses overwhelmed. The cold was a living thing, seeping from the stone walls, through the soles of her worn boots, and into her bones. It was a deep, ancient cold, the kind that feels like it has never known the sun. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, a counter-rhythm to the eternal moan of the wind outside and the distant, percussive crash of waves against the rocks below. She fumbled in her coat pocket for the small flashlight she kept clipped there, its beam a weak, trembling sword against the oppressive gloom. She swept it across the space. She was in a circular room at the base of the tower. The walls were thick, unadorned stone, glistening with a fine sheen of moisture. A patina of green and black mold crept up from the floor, a slow, patient reclamation by nature. In the center of the room, a spiral staircase of cast iron began its relentless climb into the shadows above, each step a filigree of rust and decay. The air was heavy with the silence of abandonment. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the flashlight's beam. A thick layer of grime and debris covered the floor, sand blown in through some unseen crack, desiccated leaves, the skeletal remains of a small bird. This was not just neglect. It was a profound and total surrender to time. Her first thought was of the twins. How could she possibly bring them in here? The dampness was a threat, the cold a danger, the decay a world of unseen hazards. The fragile hope that had carried her this far began to crumble, replaced by a familiar, sickening wave of despair. She was about to retreat, to pull the heavy door shut on this foolish dream and crawl back to the relative safety of her car, when a small sound from outside jolted her. It was Luna, her voice a thin, questioning cry. "Mommy!" Alani's breath hitched. She couldn't let them see her fear. She couldn't let them feel this crushing disappointment. Steeling herself, she stepped back outside, blinking in the stark light. "It's okay, sweetie. Mommy's just looking at our new castle." She forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt like it might crack her face. Kai was awake now, his dark eyes wide as he stared at the towering structure. "It's a giant's house," he whispered, a note of awe in his voice. In his eyes, she didn't see a ruin. She saw an adventure. That innocent perspective was a lifeline. She took it. The next few hours were a blur of frantic, desperate labor. She worked with a ferocity born of necessity, fueled by the last of her adrenaline. She pulled the car as close to the entrance as she could, using its headlights to illuminate the ground floor room. She swept out the worst of the debris with a broken piece of driftwood she found on the path. She used old blankets from the car to block the draft from the ill-fitting door. She found the entrance to the attached keeper's cottage, its door even more stubborn than the first. Inside was a small, two-room space in slightly better condition. A rusted wood-burning stove stood in the main room, its flue pipe disconnected and dangling. The windows were boarded, but the roof seemed mostly intact. This, she decided, would be their starting point. This would be home. She brought the twins inside, wrapping them in their thickest coats and setting them up in a corner with their coloring books and the one remaining bag of animal crackers. "We're camping," she told them, her voice bright and false. "An indoor camping trip," They accepted it without question. Their world defined not by their surroundings but by her presence. While they played, Alani assessed the wood stove. It was her only hope for warmth. It was a beast of cast iron, covered in layers of rust and soot. Using a tire iron from the car's trunk, she scraped and pried, her knuckles raw and bleeding. She managed to reconnect the flue pipe, securing it with strips of metal she tore from a rusted bucket. She scavenged for fuel, gathering driftwood from the rocky shore, her arms aching as she carried load after load back to the cottage. The wood was damp, salty. It would be a struggle to get it to burn. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and charcoal, a profound sense of isolation descended upon her. There was no one for miles. No electricity grid, no running water, no cell service. The world had been reduced to this rock, this tower, and the three of them. The wind rose to a gale, rattling the boards on the windows and screaming like a tormented spirit. The first attempt to light the stove was a failure. The damp wood smoked and smoldered, filling the small room with acrid, choking fumes that sent them all coughing into the cold air outside. Alani felt a surge of panic. Without warmth, they wouldn't make it through the night. She tried again, using the last of her paper napkins and a page torn from the car's owner's manual as kindling. She blew on the embers until her lungs burned and her vision swam, tears of smoke and frustration streaming down her face. And then, a small, hesitant flicker of orange. A tiny flame caught, wavered, then held. It grew, slowly, painfully, licking at the salty wood. A wave of warmth, weak but real, began to push back against the oppressive cold. Alani sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She gathered the twins close, their small bodies nestled against hers, and they watched the fire as if it were the most miraculous thing in the world. In that moment they ate cold crackers for dinner, huddled together on a blanket in the growing circle of warmth. The firelight cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the storm raged, but inside their small, fragile sanctuary, there was a tentative peace. Later, with the children asleep, their breath soft and even, Alani stared into the flames. This place was a crucible. It would either forge her into something stronger or break her completely. She had survived the first day, but as the fire dwindled and the deep, profound cold of the stone began to creep back into the room, she knew the true test had just begun. She was the keeper of this place now, and the keeper of her children. It was a terrifying, absolute responsibility. The lighthouse held no light, but in the flickering heart of the fire, she held onto a desperate glimmer of hope. Days bled into a week, each one a grueling test of endurance. Alani's world shrank to a cycle of fundamental needs: warmth, food, safety. The lighthouse demanded everything from her, and she gave it, her body aching with a weariness so deep it felt cellular. Mornings began before sunrise, in the frigid pre-dawn gloom. Her first task was always the fire. She would coax the embers back to life, her breath pluming in the cold air of the small cottage room, her hands stiff and clumsy until the stove began to radiate its life-giving heat. Then came the search for fuel. She spent hours each day combing the jagged shoreline, gathering driftwood that the relentless Atlantic tossed onto the rocks. Each piece was a small victory, a temporary reprieve from the cold. She learned the character of the wood. The dense, waterlogged pieces that would smolder for hours, the light, dry bits that burned hot and fast. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and perpetually sore, her nails chipped and lined with grime. Water was a constant, pressing concern. She found an old cistern behind the cottage, half filled with stagnant rainwater. She boiled every drop on the wood stove in a dented pot she'd found, a painstaking process that yielded just enough for drinking and a small basin for washing. The water tasted of stone and sky. Their food supply dwindled at an alarming rate. The crackers and canned goods she'd had in the car were nearly gone. Panic began to set in, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her exhaustion. She had to venture back to the nearest town, a place called Port Blossom, a 40-minute drive over the treacherous road. Leaving the twins was unthinkable, so she bundled them into the car, the trip becoming a monumental expedition. Port Blossom was a small, forgotten fishing village that seemed as weathered as the lighthouse itself. The people were taciturn, their faces carved by wind and hardship. In the small general store, Alani used the last of her emergency cash to buy flour, dried beans, oats, and a small bag of potatoes. The store owner, a man with faded blue eyes, looked at her worn clothes and the two quiet children clinging to her legs. "You the one who bought the old light?" he asked, his voice rough as barnacles. Alani just nodded, bracing for judgment. He grunted, then added a small bag of apples to her supplies. "For the kids," he said gruffly, turning away before she could properly thank him. The small act of kindness was so unexpected it brought tears to her eyes on the drive back. It was a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in the world, even here at its edge. The lighthouse, however, remained her primary adversary and her only shelter. She began to explore it cautiously during the precious hours when the twins were napping. The spiral staircase was a treacherous ascent, its iron steps groaning under her weight. She climbed slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through decades of darkness and disuse. Each level was a circular room, empty save for dust and the ghosts of forgotten purpose. One room had clearly been a bedroom, another a small kitchen, its iron sink torn from the wall. Higher still, a storage room, filled with rotting canvas and coiled ropes that crumbled to dust at her touch. In that room, tucked away in a dry corner, she found a treasure, a small, leather-bound logbook. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown, but the script was elegant, precise. It was the journal of the last keeper, a man named Isaiah Blackwood. The entries were dated from the late 19th century. She took it back to the cottage, and at night, by the light of the fire, she would read his words. He wrote of storms that shook the tower to its foundations, of ships lost and saved, of the profound, crushing loneliness of his vigil. He wrote of the light itself as a living entity, a cyclopean eye that held back the fathomless dark. His words, written over a century ago, became a strange sort of companionship. He had known this cold, this wind, this isolation. He had endured. His resilience, documented in faded ink, gave her strength. The highest level, just below the lamp room, was the watchroom. It was surrounded by a ring of small, thick-paned windows. Most were clouded with salt and grime, but one on the landward side was surprisingly clear. From here, she could see for miles. The winding ribbon of the road, the distant smudge of Port Blossom, the vast, unbroken expanse of the evergreen forest. It was a god's-eye view, and it gave her a sense of perspective. She was a tiny speck in this immense, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape. The final, steepest flight of stairs led to the lamp room itself. The door was iron and heavy, its handle seized with rust. It took her 2 days of effort, using a can of lubricant she'd bought in town and the tire iron as a lever, to force it open. The room was a cage of glass and iron, a space designed for a single, sacred purpose. The great Fresnel lens, the heart of the lighthouse, was gone. In its place was a gaping hole in the floor and a heavy iron mounting pedestal. But the room itself was magnificent. Even covered in grime, the curved glass panels offered a breathtaking 360-degree panorama of the sky and the sea. This was the pinnacle of her new world. It was also the place where the leak was worst. During a heavy rain, water streamed from a spot where the iron roof met the glass, running down the wall and pooling on the floor. It was a problem she couldn't ignore. The water threatened the integrity of the entire structure. One afternoon, armed with a bucket and a stiff brush, she decided to tackle the source of the leak. The lamp room was cold, the wind whistling through invisible cracks in the glass. She traced the water's path up the curved iron wall to a large, rectangular plate bolted into the structure. It seemed to be an old access panel, perhaps for servicing the lamp mechanism. The bolts were rusted solid, but the plate itself seemed slightly loose at the bottom. Water was weeping from behind it. She thought if she could just tighten it, maybe the leak would stop. She pushed at it, then pried at the edge with her tire iron. There was a groan of stressed metal, and a shower of rust flakes rained down. And then she saw it. Not a gap, but a perfectly straight, clean line. A seam. It wasn't an access panel. It was a door. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against her ribs. She scraped away more of the rust and grime. The seam continued, forming a perfect rectangle in the iron wall, a shape so precise it could not be accidental. It was seamlessly integrated into the wall, its existence disguised by a century of corrosion and neglect. It was a vault. Isaiah Blackwood, the lonely keeper who wrote of storms and solitude, had built a vault in the eye of his lighthouse, a place designed to hold the most precious thing of all. And Alani, standing there in the cold, high room with the wind screaming outside, knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that her life, and the lives of her children, were about to change forever. The discovery of the vault door shifted something in the air, charging it with a tense electric potential. The lighthouse was no longer just a shelter or a challenge. It was a mystery. For 2 days, Alani could do nothing but think about it, her mind circling the rusted iron rectangle in the lamp room. During the day, she went through the motions of survival, gathering wood, boiling water, caring for the twins. But her thoughts were always hundreds of feet up, in that glass-walled room. At night, she couldn't sleep. She would lie in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic breathing of her children and the roar of the ocean, and she would see the faint, perfect seam in her mind's eye. It was a line drawn between her old life of desperation and a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The vault was sealed tight. There was no handle, no visible lock, only the faintest outline of the door. It was a puzzle left by a man long dead. Her first attempts to open it were crude and fruitless. She pushed, she pulled. She hammered at the edges with the tire iron until her arms ached and the iron rang with a dull, final thud. The vault remained impassive, a silent testament to its creator's ingenuity. She knew brute force was not the answer. Isaiah Blackwood had not been a man of brute force. His journal entries were filled with observations on engineering, patience, and the meticulous mechanics of the light. He would have created a key, a combination, a sequence known only to him. Frustration gave way to a new kind of determination. She had to think like him. She had to see the lighthouse through his eyes. She brought his logbook up to the lamp room, the wind whipping the brittle pages as she climbed. She sat on the cold floor, the vast, churning seascape her backdrop, and began to read his words again, not for companionship this time, but for clues. She searched for numbers, for patterns, for any mention of a secret. His entries were mostly prosaic, detailing weather patterns, fuel consumption for the lamp, and sightings of ships. But woven throughout were philosophical musings, quotes from mariners, and personal reflections. One phrase appeared again and again in different contexts. In darkness, find the bearing. He used it when describing navigating a ship through a storm, when aligning the great lens, and once, poignantly, when writing about the death of his wife. The world is now shadow, he wrote, but even in darkness, one must find the bearing. It was a nautical term, a direction, a number on a compass. On a hunch, she went back down to the watchroom, the level just below the lamp. There, etched into the stone sill of the one clear window, the one facing the land, was a small, crudely carved compass rose. It was barely visible, worn smooth by time. At the center of the rose, and at the points for north, east, south, and west were small, drilled holes, as if something had once been mounted there. But it was the numbers that made her breath catch. Faintly scratched beside the cardinal points were numbers: 33, 18, 06, 21. They weren't bearings. They didn't correspond to any logical navigational data. They were just numbers. Could it be that simple? A combination? She scrambled back up the final flight of stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The vault door had no dial, but as she examined it more closely, her fingers tracing every inch of its corroded surface, she found them. For small, almost imperceptible indentations, arranged in a diamond pattern near the center of the door. They were so filled with rust and grime that they were nearly invisible. Working frantically with the tip of a nail she'd found, she began to clean them out. Underneath the corrosion were small, circular dials, no bigger than her thumb, each etched with numbers. They were stiff, almost frozen in place. She applied a few drops of the precious lubricant and worked them back and forth, gently, patiently, until they began to turn with a faint, gritty clicking sound. The wind howled outside the glass, a rising crescendo of sound as if the elements themselves were protesting this intrusion. Alani's hands were trembling, not from cold, but from a terrifying, exhilarating hope. She took a deep breath, the salty air stinging her lungs. In darkness, find the bearing. She began with the first number from the compass rose. 33. She turned the top dial, click by painstaking click, until the number 33 aligned with a tiny, almost invisible scratch mark. Then the right dial, 18. The bottom dial, 06. And finally, the left dial, 21. For a moment, nothing happened. The vault remained silent, impassive. A wave of crushing disappointment washed over her. It had been a foolish guess, a desperate fantasy. She sagged against the cold iron, the energy draining out of her. And then she heard it, a soft, deep click from within the wall. It was followed by a series of whirring, mechanical sounds, the sound of ancient, heavy tumblers falling into place. A low, resonant groan echoed through the small room as a section of the iron wall, the section she had mistaken for the door itself, began to retract inward. It wasn't a door that swung open. The entire rectangular plate slid silently and smoothly into the wall, revealing a dark, square opening. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, smelling not of damp and decay, but of old paper, leather, and something else, a faint metallic scent like cold coins. She stood frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and awe. She had breached the sanctum. She had opened Isaiah Blackwood's secret heart. Using her flashlight, its beam now seeming impossibly frail, she peered into the darkness. The vault was small, a walk-in space no bigger than a closet, its walls lined with thick, dark wood. And it was full, not with treasure chests of gold and jewels, but with something far more practical and overwhelming. Stacked neatly on shelves were dozens of tin boxes, their surfaces dull with age. Leather-bound ledgers, just like the one she'd found, were piled on the floor. But it was the objects in the center of the vault that stopped her breath. Two large, heavy chests, made of dark wood and bound with iron straps, sat side by side. They were not locked. With a trembling hand, she reached out and lifted the lid of the first chest. The flashlight beam fell upon stacks and stacks of paper currency, bundled with twine. The bills were old, the portraits unfamiliar, but their value was unmistakable. The second chest held something else. It was filled to the brim with gold coins, shimmering dully in the weak light. But there was more. Beneath a layer of coins was a thick portfolio tied with a ribbon. Alani lifted it out. Inside were stacks of bearer bonds, stock certificates for railroads and steel companies long since absorbed into modern conglomerates, and property deeds for vast tracts of land throughout the state. On the very top of the portfolio was a single, sealed envelope. On its face, written in Isaiah Blackwood's elegant script, were two words. To the keeper, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the wax seal. Alani opened the letter. It was a single page, the paper thick and expensive. The ink was as dark and clear as the day it was written. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you are the one who has been chosen, not by me, but by the light itself. You have proven your worth through diligence and a refusal to be broken by the solitude of this place. You have shown yourself to be a guardian. What you have found is not a treasure to be spent, but a trust to be administered. I gathered this fortune not from greed, but from prudence and a deep distrust of the fleeting empires of men. It is a bulwark against the storm, a guardian fund for this coast and its people. A final ledger in the tin box marked with a compass rose will detail its contents. The sum is significant, $442 million, by 1901 accounting. Its purpose is to be used only in a time of great need, to protect the innocent, preserve the natural world of this shore, and ensure that a light of hope, be it from this tower or from the human heart, never goes out. This is now your burden. It is your duty. May you be a wiser steward than I ever was. Signed, Isaiah Blackwood. Keeper Alani sank to her knees, the letter fluttering from her grasp. The flashlight beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the impossible fortune. $442 million. The number was meaningless, an abstraction beyond comprehension. The wind shrieked, a wild, triumphant cry. She was no longer just a homeless mother. She was the keeper of a king's ransom. And as the weight of Isaiah Blackwood's words settled upon her, she realized this discovery was not an ending. It was the beginning of a storm far greater than any she had ever faced. The number echoed in the hollow spaces of Alani's mind, a figure so vast it defied comprehension. $442 million. It was not a sum of money. It was a gravitational force, warping the reality she had known. For an entire day after opening the vault, she did nothing. She sealed the heavy door, its mechanism now moving with a whisper-quiet hum, and retreated from the lamp room as if fleeing the scene of a crime. She tried to immerse herself in the familiar, comforting rhythm of survival. She stoked the fire. She cooked a meal of beans and potatoes for the twins. She read them a story from their one tattered picture book. But everything was different. The world was overlaid with a shimmering, unreal quality. The weight of the iron key in her pocket now felt impossibly heavy, a symbol not just of ownership but of a crushing, terrifying responsibility. Isaiah Blackwood's letter had transformed her from a finder to a custodian. The fortune was not a lottery ticket. It was a crown of thorns. His words, "This is now your burden," played over and over in her head. A burden. For a woman whose only goal had been to find a safe, warm place for her children. The sudden imposition of a sacred duty to protect an entire coastline and its people was a staggering, paralyzing weight. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to take a single stack of bills, an amount that would still be a fortune to her, and disappear. Buy a small, anonymous house somewhere in the middle of the country, give Kai and Luna a normal life, and forget this lighthouse, this vault, this ghost of a man and his impossible demands. The temptation was a sweet, insidious poison. Promised freedom, simplicity, an end to the struggle. She could walk away and no one would ever know. The secret would be safe, sealed behind tons of iron and stone at the top of a forgotten tower. But then she would look at Kai and Luna, their faces so open and full of trust as they played on the cottage floor, their imaginations turning a piece of driftwood into a pirate ship. What kind of future would she be buying for them with stolen money? What kind of woman would she become? The foundation of their lives would be built on a lie, on a duty shirked. She would spend the rest of her days looking over her shoulder, haunted not by poverty, but by the ghost of the guardian she had refused to be. And she would look at Blackwood's logbook, its pages filled with a sense of honor and profound responsibility. He had spent 50 years in this isolated place, tending a light to save strangers. He had gathered a fortune not for himself, but for a future he would never see. To betray that trust felt like a sacrilege. It felt like extinguishing the very light he had spent his life protecting. Slowly, painfully, over the course of long, sleepless nights filled with the sound of the sea, the temptation receded, replaced by a fragile, terrifying resolve. She would not run. She would try to honor the trust that had been placed in her. Her first step was to understand the scope of what she was protecting. She brought the ledger marked with the compass rose down from the vault. By the flickering light of the fire, she opened it. The pages were a testament to Blackwood's meticulous nature. Every asset was detailed. The serial numbers of the bonds, the exact locations of the properties, the ledgers of the businesses he had invested in. He had used a small initial inheritance and, through decades of shrewd, patient investment in emerging industries like railroads, steel, and electricity, had built an empire from his lonely perch. The $442 million was not an exaggeration. If anything, given a century of compound interest and asset appreciation, it was likely a conservative estimate. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. She, a woman who had been counting loose change for gas, was now theoretically one of the wealthiest people in the country. The absurdity of it was almost too much to bear. She realized she needed help. She was completely out of her depth. The world of finance, of law, of foundations and trusts was as foreign to her as another planet. But who could she trust? The moment she revealed the vault's existence, she would unleash a firestorm. Governments, institutions, forgotten heirs, they would all descend like vultures. The secret was her only shield, but it was also a prison. Her isolation, once a hardship, was now her greatest asset. No one came to Solitude Point. No one knew she was there, save for the gruff store owner in Port Blossom. But that isolation couldn't last forever. The weather was turning colder. The car's registration was about to expire. The twins needed more than just a diet of beans and potatoes. The real world, with its demands and its dangers, was going to find her sooner or later. The first intrusion came in a form she didn't expect. A small boat, a fishing trawler, appeared offshore one morning, closer than any vessel had come before. It bobbed on the waves for a long time, and Alani felt a prickle of unease. She watched from the high window of the watchroom as a man on the deck raised a pair of binoculars and scanned the lighthouse. Her heart pounded. Had she been discovered? After an hour that stretched for an eternity, the boat moved on, continuing its journey down the coast. But the incident shattered her sense of security. She was visible. She was exposed. A few days later, a second, more official-looking vehicle than her own sedan appeared at the end of the rutted track. It was a clean, dark SUV with a government plate. A man in a crisp suit and polished shoes got out, looking profoundly out of place against the wild, untamed backdrop of the coast. He walked to the base of the lighthouse, clipboard in hand, and studied the imposing structure. Alani watched him from the shadows of the cottage, her children silent behind her, her hand clutching the heavy iron key in her pocket. The man made a few notes, took a picture with his phone, and then affixed a notice to the heavy wooden door. After he drove away, Alani waited a long time before daring to go out and read it. The notice was from the county's Bureau of Historical Properties. It was a formal letter stating that a preliminary assessment was being conducted for all properties sold under the derelict property program. A mandatory inspection of the Solitude Point Lighthouse was scheduled for 2 weeks' time to ensure the new owner was complying with the vague but threatening preservation and safety covenants of the sale agreement. The letter was signed by a Mr. Sterling, deputy director. The walls were closing in. The bureaucratic world she had fled was now reaching for her. An inspection. They would come inside. They would see the conditions she was living in. They might take her children. And what if they went all the way to the top? What if they discovered the seam in the wall? The secret, her burden, and her children's future were all under imminent threat. The letter was a declaration of war. She had 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to transform a ruin into a home, and to fortify a secret that could change the world. The Guardian's first test had arrived. The official notice from the Bureau of Historical Properties acted as a catalyst, transforming Alani's passive anxiety into focused, frenetic action. The abstract threat of the future had been given a name, Mr. Sterling, and a date. 2 weeks. It was an impossibly short amount of time, but she had no choice. Her first priority was the children. The thought of them being taken from her was a cold, sharp terror that eclipsed even the fear of the vault being discovered. The cottage had to look not just habitable, but like a home. She worked with a desperate energy she hadn't known she possessed. She scrubbed the stone floors with sand and water until her knuckles were raw. She found old canvas sails in a storage room and, after washing them repeatedly in the sea to remove the mildew, cut them into makeshift curtains for the boarded windows. She let in the light. It was a small change, but it was transformative, chasing away the deepest shadows and making the small space feel less like a cave. She used her dwindling funds to make another trip to Port Blossom, this time buying not just food, but cleaning supplies, cheap blankets, and too-thin mattresses. She also bought a small, second-hand propane stove, a luxury that felt like a miracle. It meant she could cook without constantly feeding the ravenous wood stove. For the twins, she created a dedicated play area in a corner, laying down a clean sailcloth as a rug and arranging their few toys. She used charcoal from the fire to draw a sprawling mural of a smiling sun and friendly sea creatures on one of the stone walls. It was a desperate, beautiful act of defiance against the gloom. Kai and Luna watched her labors with wide, curious eyes. They seemed to sense the shift in her energy, the urgency that now propelled her every move. They began to help in their own small ways, carrying small pieces of driftwood, wiping down a low section of wall with a damp rag, their small hands mimicking her own. They were a team, a tiny, resilient family against the world. Her second priority was the tower itself. An inspection meant Mr. Sterling would want to see the entire structure. The ground floor was manageable, but the spiral staircase and the upper levels were a death trap of rust and debris. She spent days sweeping the steps, her broom a flimsy weapon against a century of accumulated filth. She tightened loose railings, hammering old nails back into place with a rock. She cleaned the grime from the inside of the watchroom windows, allowing a panoramic view of the coastline to flood the space. The lighthouse began to feel less like a ruin and more like a place that was being cared for, a place that was breathing again. The lamp room, however, was her greatest challenge. It was the heart of the secret. She couldn't deny an inspector access, but she had to ensure the vault remained hidden. She scrubbed the room clean, but focused her efforts on misdirection. She took one of the large, tin boxes from the vault, one filled with mundane records of lamp oil shipments, and placed it in a corner of the lamp room. She left it open, as if she had been sorting through it. She found a set of old, rusted tools and arranged them near the wall plate that concealed the vault, hoping to create the impression that it was just a piece of machinery she was attempting to repair. It was a fragile deception, a stage play for an audience of one, and she could only pray it would be convincing enough. In the evenings, exhausted and aching, she would retreat to the pages of Isaiah Blackwood's journal. She was no longer just looking for clues. She was searching for strength. His stoicism, his unwavering sense of duty in the face of profound isolation, became her guide. He wrote about a local man, a fisherman named Elias, who would bring him supplies and news from the mainland. Elias Vance, he wrote, is a man as steady as the tides. His family has read the water here for generations. He understands the soul of this place. The name stuck in her mind. Vance. She had seen the name on a faded sign on a fishing boat in Port Blossom's small harbor. As the day of the inspection drew closer, her anxiety mounted. What if her efforts weren't enough? Mr. Sterling was not just a man. He was the embodiment of a system, a faceless bureaucracy that had the power to crush her. She practiced what she would say, her voice trembling in the empty rooms of the lighthouse. She was a single mother trying to make a home. She was restoring a piece of history. She was honoring the spirit of the dollar sale program. The lies felt thin and brittle. The day arrived, gray and blustery. The sea was a turmoil of white-capped waves. Alani dressed herself and the children in their cleanest, though still worn, clothes. She had a small pot of bean soup simmering on the propane stove, a pathetic attempt at domesticity. She saw the dark SUV arrive at the end of the track precisely at the scheduled time. Mr. Sterling emerged, the same impeccably dressed man from before, his polished shoes ill-suited for the muddy path. He walked with an air of brisk, impatient authority. Alani met him at the door, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm Alani Freeman." He gave her a curt nod, his eyes sweeping over her, the cottage, the children peering from behind her legs, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Freeman, let's get this over with." His tone was dismissive, as if she were a minor annoyance in his day. He stepped inside, his gaze cataloging everything. The clean floors, the makeshift curtains, the children's drawings on the wall. He made a note on his clipboard. "Primitive but clean," he muttered to himself. He asked her a series of perfunctory questions. Where did she get her water? How was she managing for heat? Was the structure sound? Alani answered calmly, explaining her systems for boiling water and her careful use of the wood stove. She projected an image of competence, of a woman in control of a difficult situation. Then came the part she dreaded. "I'll need to see the tower." She led him to the base of the spiral staircase. He looked up into the darkness, a flicker of something. Perhaps grudging respect, perhaps just surprise, in his eyes. "You've been cleaning," he stated. "It's a historical building," Alani replied simply. "It deserves to be cared for." They ascended, the iron steps groaning under his weight. He ran a hand along the railing, checked the walls for cracks, his movements efficient and professional. In the watchroom, he paused, looking out the newly cleaned window. "Quite a view," he admitted, the first hint of something other than official business in his voice. Finally, they reached the lamp room. Alani held her breath. The wind whistled around the glass, the sound amplifying the tension. Mr. Sterling stepped into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the 360-degree vista. He noted the missing lens, the heavy mounting pedestal. Then his gaze fell on the section of wall containing the vault. He walked over to it, rapping his knuckles against the iron plate. It gave a solid, resonant thud. Alani's blood ran cold. "Old access panel for the clockwork mechanism," he said, more to himself than to her. He saw the rusted tools she had laid out. "Trying to get it open?" "I was thinking about it," Alani said, her voice tight, "to see if I can stop a leak." "It seems to be coming from behind there," he grunted, making another note. "Don't bother. The whole housing needs to be replaced. The county has no budget for it." He seemed satisfied. Her deception had worked. He had seen what she wanted him to see. A determined but naive woman struggling to fix up a ruin. He hadn't seen the secret. As they descended, he seemed to relax slightly. The immediate threat of structural collapse, which was likely his primary concern, was not present. At the bottom, he turned to her. "The official report will state that while the living conditions are unorthodox, you are in compliance with the basic safety covenants of the agreement. You're cleaning the place up, which is more than we expected." He paused, a strange look on his face. "I don't know why anyone would choose to live out here, but you seem to be managing." For now, he turned to leave, and Alani felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had passed the test. But as he reached the door, he stopped and turned back, his expression hardening again. "Just be advised, Ms. Freeman. The city is reviewing the entire derelict property program. There's a motion to reclaim certain high-value historical assets that were, perhaps, disposed of too hastily. Property like this, a landmark, it has value beyond $1. Don't get too comfortable." And with that parting shot, he was gone, his SUV disappearing down the track. The relief she had felt curdled into a new, more insidious fear. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The city knew it had given away something valuable. They didn't know how valuable, not yet. But they were coming. Mr. Sterling was just the first wave. Mr. Sterling's warning lingered in the air long after his SUV had vanished. A toxic residue that poisoned Alani's hard-won sense of security. High-value historical assets. The phrase was a carefully chosen piece of bureaucratic jargon, a legal placeholder for a future claim. The city was testing the waters, sending a scout to assess the landscape before launching their invasion. Alani knew she was living on borrowed time. Her solitary struggle was no longer enough. She needed an ally, someone who understood the history of this place, someone who understood the people of this coast. She needed to find Elias Vance. The name from Isaiah Blackwood's journal had become a mantra of hope. The next morning, she drove into Port Blossom, not for supplies, but for information. The town's small harbor was a forest of masts and rigging, the air thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and fish. She found the boat she had seen before, the Tidal Child, its faded paint peeling, its decks cluttered with nets and traps. The name Vance was painted on its stern. A man was on the deck, mending a net, his hands moving with a slow, practiced rhythm. He was older, perhaps in his late 70s, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from driftwood. His skin was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, faded blue that had seen 1,000 horizons. He looked up as she approached, his expression neutral, watchful. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting on the seabed. Are you Elias Vance? Alani asked, her own voice feeling thin and uncertain. He squinted at her. I am. And you're the woman at the light. It wasn't a question. News, she realized, traveled fast in a town this small. My name is Alani Freeman. I know, he said, returning his attention to his net. His dismissal was not unkind, but it was clear he was not a man for idle chatter. Alani pressed on, feeling a sense of desperation. I found your name in the keeper's logbook. Isaiah Blackwood wrote about you. This got his attention. He stopped his work, his gnarled hands falling still on the net. He looked at her properly now, a flicker of sharp intelligence in his pale eyes. He wrote about my grandfather, he corrected her gently. Also named Elias, the first Elias. I'm the third, he paused, studying her face. You've been reading the old logs? Every night, Alani admitted. They're a comfort. He gave a slow, deep nod, a sign of understanding that transcended words. He had known the loneliness of the coast his entire life. Blackwood was a good man, Elias said. A strange man, kept to himself. But he had a deep respect for this place. For the sea. Most people these days, they just see the view. They don't see the soul of it. Encouraged. Alani took a breath and laid out her fears, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told him about Mr. Sterling, the inspection, the veiled threat about the city reclaiming the lighthouse. She didn't mention the vault. The secret was too new, too dangerous to share. But she conveyed the weight of the pressure she was under. Elias listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unchanging. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the cry of gulls and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. Sterling, Elias said, the name tasting like something sour in his mouth. He's from the city. They don't understand a thing about this coast. They see a picture on a postcard, a line item in a budget. They've been trying to get their hands on Solitude Point for years. Wanted to sell it to some resort developer from California. But the cost of running utilities out there, stabilizing the bluff. It was always too much. So they let it rot. He looked at her, his eyes piercing. Giving it to you for $1 was their way of washing their hands of it. They figured you'd last a month, maybe 2, then give up. The place would be condemned, and they could tear it down, sell the land clean. They never figured anyone would actually try to stay. To make a home, his words confirmed her worst fears. She wasn't just a property owner. She was an obstacle in a long-running game of real estate and greed. What can I do? Alani asked, her voice barely a whisper. They have lawyers. They have power. Aye, they do, Elias agreed. But we have the truth. He finally set down his net and gestured to a wooden crate on the dock. Sit, Alani sat, and for the next hour, Elias became her teacher. He told her the history of the lighthouse, a history that wasn't written in any official documents. He told her about Isaiah Blackwood, how the townspeople thought he was an eccentric recluse, but how he had secretly funded the town's first school, paid for the doctor's new equipment, and provided for the widows of fishermen lost at sea, all through anonymous donations delivered by Elias's grandfather. He was the town's unseen guardian, its silent benefactor. He believed that wealth was like seawater, Elias said, his voice low and resonant. Hoarded, it becomes stagnant and poisonous. Circulated, it gives life. The words resonated so deeply with the letter in the vault that Alani felt a shiver run down her spine. Elias didn't know about the fortune, but he understood the man who had built it. He explained the complex, often unwritten laws of the coast. He told her about maritime salvage rights, about historical preservation societies that could be powerful allies, about the deep-seated distrust the local community had for the city government that had neglected them for decades. He was giving her ammunition. He was drawing her a map of the battlefield. Sterling and his kind, they see a derelict building on a piece of rock, Elias said, his gaze turning toward the distant point where the lighthouse stood, a faint, needle-like silhouette against the gray sky. They don't see that it's the heart of this whole coast. It's our history, our landmark. You're not just fighting for a home, girl. You're fighting for the soul of this place. For the first time since she had arrived, Alani felt a flicker of genuine power. It wasn't the power of money, which was still an abstract and terrifying concept. It was the power of purpose. Elias had given her a context for her struggle, connecting her personal fight for survival to a much larger, older story. She wasn't just Alani Freeman, a single mother. She was the new keeper, the guardian. They'll be back, Elias said, his voice a grim certainty. And they'll bring more than clipboards next time. They'll bring lawyers. They'll try to bury you in paper. They'll try to scare you. They'll try to wear you down. He stood up, his tall, weathered frame silhouetted against the bright water. But this place, this coast, it knows how to wear things down too. It's patient. You need to be patient. And you need to be strong as the rock the light was built on. He went into the cabin of his boat and returned with a heavy, waxed canvas bag. Fish, he said, pressing it into her hands. And some vegetables from my wife's garden. Children need more than beans. Alani was so moved she couldn't speak. She could only nod her thanks, her throat thick with emotion. As she walked away from the harbor, the weight of the bag in her arms a welcome burden. She knew she had found what she was looking for. She had found an ally. She was no longer alone. The city might have its lawyers and its power, but she had the truth. And she had the trust of a quiet, lonely man who had built a fortune as a bulwark against the storm. She was ready for the next wave. The brief period of peace that followed her meeting with Elias was a precious, fragile thing. Alani used the time to solidify her position, both physically and mentally. The fresh food from Elias and his wife, a quiet, kind woman named Sarah, brought color back to the twins' cheeks and a renewed strength to her own limbs. The cottage began to feel more and more like a real home, warmed by the steady heat of the stove and filled with the scent of baking bread. A simple recipe she'd learned from Sarah. She also established a routine. Mornings were for lessons with the twins, using shells and stones as counting tools and the sky and sea as their classroom. Afternoons were for work on the lighthouse, a slow, methodical reclamation of the grand old structure. She cleared the last of the debris, patched a few small leaks in the cottage roof with tar she'd bought in town, and even managed to get one of the old water pumps connected to the cistern working, giving them a steady, if cold, supply of water indoors. But her most important work was done at night, by lamplight, at a small, sturdy table she had salvaged from one of the tower rooms. There she studied. Elias had given her a box of old books and pamphlets, histories of the county, guides to maritime law, and binders full of newspaper clippings about the city's long and often contentious relationship with its coastal towns. She absorbed it all, piecing together the political and legal landscape she now inhabited. She read about zoning laws, historical preservation easements, and the rights of property owners. And she read Isaiah Blackwood's financial ledgers. She began to trace the vast, invisible empire he had built. She saw how his initial investments in local shipping had grown, how he had astutely moved his capital into railroads just as the country was expanding west, and then into the steel and manufacturing that built the nation's cities. It was a masterclass in patient, long-term capitalism, all conducted from a single room overlooking the ocean. The knowledge was empowering. The fortune was no longer just a terrifying, abstract number. It was a real, tangible entity with a history and a logic she was beginning to understand. The calm was shattered 2 months after Mr. Sterling's visit. It happened on a bright, cold morning. A sleek, expensive car, utterly alien to the rugged landscape, made its way slowly up the track. It was not a government vehicle. Alani watched its approach from the watchroom, her stomach tightening into a cold knot. Elias had warned her this would happen. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, her silver hair cut in a severe, elegant style. She moved with an aura of unshakable confidence and authority. She carried a slim leather briefcase. This was not a bureaucrat. This was a predator. Alani met her at the door, positioning herself squarely in the threshold, the twins safely inside the cottage behind her. "Can I help you?" Alani asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. The woman offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. Ms. Alani Freeman? My name is Genevieve Thorne. I'm an attorney with the firm of Thorne, Cromwell, and Finch. May I have a moment of your time? Her voice was smooth, polished, and carried the unmistakable weight of money and power. I'm rather busy, Alani said, standing her ground. Thorne's smile didn't waver. I'm sure you are, but I believe this will be worth your while. I represent the estate of Isaiah Blackwood. The name, spoken in this woman's crisp, legalistic tone, felt like a violation. Alani's blood ran cold. How could they possibly know? I'm not sure what that has to do with me, Alani said, her mind racing. It has everything to do with you, Miss Freeman. You see, my clients, the last living descendants of Mr. Blackwood's estranged brother, have recently come into possession of certain family letters. Letters that describe, in some detail, a significant personal fortune that Mr. Blackwood concealed for safekeeping, a fortune for which there is no public record of disbursement. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. When we learned that Mr. Blackwood's only significant property, this lighthouse, had been sold for the nominal sum of $1, our curiosity was, shall we say, piqued. We believe Mr. Blackwood hid his assets here. Alani's carefully constructed world began to tilt on its axis. They didn't know for sure. They were guessing, fishing, but it was a terrifyingly accurate guess. She had to remain impassive. Any flicker of recognition would be a confession. This is a very old, very empty building, Miss Thorne. I can assure you, if there was a fortune here, the city would have found it long before I did. Thorne's sharp eyes scanned the lighthouse, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Perhaps it would take a certain kind of diligence to find what a man like Isaiah Blackwood chose to hide. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and deeply private individual. She opened her briefcase. My clients are prepared to be reasonable. They are the legal heirs to his estate. Anything of value found on this property rightfully belongs to them. However, they are willing to offer you a finder's fee, a reward for your cooperation in locating these assets. Let's say a one-time payment of $500,000. In exchange for full access to the property and your silence, the offer was staggering. $500,000. It was more money than Alani had ever dreamed of. It was a ticket out, a clean slate, a new life for her and the twins, far away from this cold, demanding coast. The temptation she had fought off in the lonely darkness of the lamp room was back, now standing before her in a tailored suit and offering a contract. All she had to do was say yes. Let them have the burden. Let them have the fight with the city. She could take the money and disappear. Her heart pounded. She looked past Thorne's shoulder to the churning gray sea, the same sea Isaiah Blackwood had watched for 50 years. She thought of his words, a trust to be administered, a bulwark against the storm. She thought of Elias and his grandfather and the generations of people this coast had sustained and been sustained by. This wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. It was about right and wrong. To accept this offer would be to sell not just a fortune, but a soul, Blackwood's and her own. She met Genevieve Thorne's piercing gaze, and for the first time, she felt not fear, but a cold, hard anger. Miss Thorne, Alani said, her voice low and steady, imbued with a strength she didn't know she had. This is my home. You are on my property. There is no fortune here, and you are not welcome. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. For the first time, Thorne's professional mask slipped. A flicker of genuine surprise, followed by a flash of annoyance, crossed her face. She had expected a desperate, impoverished woman who would leap at the offer. She had not expected a guardian. Ms. Freeman, Thorne said, her voice losing its smooth veneer and taking on a sharp, metallic edge. You are making a grave mistake. We will find what is here with or without your cooperation. And when we do, you will be left with nothing but the dollar you paid for this pile of rust. We will use the full power of the law. We will bury you in discovery motions and injunctions. We will prove in a court of law that you are nothing more than a squatter, trespassing on my client's inheritance, The threat was clear. The battle was no longer a potentiality. It had been declared. "Then I suggest you have your clients file the appropriate paperwork," Alani said, her voice like ice. "My answer is no." She stepped back and closed the heavy wooden door in Genevieve Thorne's stunned face. She leaned against it, her body trembling, listening as the expensive car started its engine and retreated down the path. She had faced down the second wave. But this one was different. Mr. Sterling was a bureaucrat, a functionary of a faceless system. Genevieve Thorne was a shark who smelled blood in the water. And she would be back with the full force of a legal system designed to protect the powerful and the wealthy. The fight for the Lighthouse, and for Isaiah Blackwood's soul, had truly begun. The heavy thud of the door closing on Genevieve Thorne echoed not as a victory, but as the tolling of a bell, signaling the start of a war on two fronts. On one side stood the city with its bureaucratic claims of historical ownership, represented by the persistent Mr. Sterling. On the other, the newly emerged Blackwood heirs, armed with a high-powered lawyer and a legitimate, if circumstantial, blood claim. Alani was the sole occupant of the territory they all coveted, a lonely defender of a secret kingdom. Her anger at Thorne's audacity quickly cooled into a grim, strategic resolve. She was outmatched, out-resourced, and legally vulnerable. She needed more than just the truth on her side. She needed a shield and a sword. Her first call, made from a payphone in Port Blossom to avoid any possibility of her cell signal being traced, was to Elias. She met him at his small, cluttered home, the scent of sawdust and sea salt hanging in the air. She told him everything. She started with the discovery of the vault, her voice hushed as if the walls might have ears. She described the contents, the ledgers, the gold, the impossible sum of money. And she showed him the letter. She watched his weathered face as he read Isaiah Blackwood's words, his pale eyes tracing the elegant script. He read it once, then a second time, his expression a mixture of awe and a deep, profound understanding. When he finally looked up, there were tears shimmering in his eyes. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather always said Blackwood was more than just a keeper. He said he was a king in a tower of iron, watching over his kingdom." He placed the letter on the table with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. "He didn't leave a treasure, Alani. He left a responsibility. The biggest one this coast has ever known." Elias's validation was a balm to her frayed nerves. He didn't see the money, he saw the purpose. He saw the legacy. When she told him about Genevieve Thorne and her offer, his face hardened. "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb," he said, quoting an old mariner's phrase. Blackwood chose his heir not by bloodline, but by character. He chose the keeper. That's you. The fortune belongs to the light, not to some distant cousins who never even knew he existed. Together, they began to plan. Elias, with his deep knowledge of the community and its history, became her strategist. He knew which local families had been saved from ruin by Blackwood's anonymous charity. He knew the stories, passed down through generations, of the keeper's quiet, steadfast guardianship. This was their moral ammunition. But they needed legal firepower. Elias made a suggestion. There was a young lawyer in a town up the coast, a man named Ben Carter. He was the grandson of a fisherman whose family had been one of Blackwood's beneficiaries. He had gone to law school on a scholarship and had come back to serve his community, specializing in environmental law and fighting for the rights of the local fishing fleets against corporate interests. "He's not fancy like your Ms. Thorne," Elias said. "But he's smart, he's hungry, and he has a deep love for this place. He's one of us." The next day, Alani and Elias drove to meet him. Ben Carter's office was a small, second-story room above a bait and tackle shop. He was young, earnest, with a sharp mind and an underdog's tenacity. Alani, cautious at first, laid out the entire situation, holding nothing back. As Ben listened, his initial skepticism melted away, replaced by a look of intense focus. When he read Blackwood's letter, he was silent for a long time. "This is unprecedented," he said finally, his voice a mixture of legal analysis and pure awe. "This letter is not a will, not in the traditional legal sense. is a moral directive, a testamentary trust of intent. Proving its validity against a direct blood claim will be an uphill battle. A very, very steep one. The legal challenges were immense. The city would argue the principle of escheat, that abandoned property, including its contents, reverts to the state. The Blackwood heirs would argue probate law, that the assets of the deceased pass to the next of kin. Alani's claim was based on a handwritten, unwitnessed letter and the esoteric concept of moral inheritance. In a court of law, it was the weakest position. But it's not impossible, Ben said, a spark of defiance in his eyes. Our argument won't be about property law. It will be about intent. We will argue that Blackwood intentionally created a new form of trust, one tied not to a person, but to a position, the keeper of the light, and a purpose. We'll use his history of anonymous charity, the testimony of the townspeople, to prove a lifelong pattern of intent. He then laid out the brutal reality. Thorne would file an injunction to have Alani removed from the property and to have the vault's contents seized and placed in escrow. The city would file a competing claim. It would be a long, ugly, and incredibly expensive fight. Where, Ben asked gently, would the funding for such a legal defense come from? Alani looked at Elias, then back at Ben. From the trust itself, she said, the words feeling momentous as she spoke them. Isaiah Blackwood created this fund as a bulwark against the storm. Well, the storm is here. It was a huge risk. Using the money to defend the money was a paradox that could be spun by her opponents as theft. But it was her only move. Ben agreed. He would work on contingency, his payment dependent on securing the foundation. They formed a plan. Ben would prepare for the inevitable legal onslaught. Elias would begin to gather affidavits from the town's oldest residents, creating a historical record of Blackwood's guardianship. Alani's role was the most difficult. She had to return to the lighthouse, to continue her life in the eye of the hurricane, and to protect the vault at all costs. She also had to make a choice. Thorne's offer of $500,000 still echoed in her mind. Now, the city, through a back-channel communication from Mr. Sterling to Ben, made its own offer. They would grant her lifetime tenancy of the lighthouse and a trust fund of $1 million for her and her children in exchange for turning over the contents. Two offers. A quiet, comfortable, secure life was being handed to her on a silver platter. All she had to do was walk away from the burden. One evening, standing in the lamp room as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors, she wrestled with the temptation. $1 million. Her children would want for nothing. No more cold nights. No more worries about food or shelter. They could have a normal life. But then she looked out at the coast, at the small lights of Port Blossom beginning to twinkle in the dusk. She saw the fishing boats returning to harbor. She thought of the school Blackwood had funded, the families he had saved. This fortune was not meant for one family. It was meant for all of them. It was a promise made by a lonely man to a place he loved. To take the settlement would be to break that promise. It would be the ultimate act of selfishness. In that moment, her choice became clear, solidifying into a core of unshakable certainty. She was not Alani Freeman, the homeless mother. She was the keeper. She walked down the spiral stairs, out of the tower, and into the small cottage where her children were sleeping. She looked at their peaceful faces, and she knew she was making the right choice not just for Blackwood, or for the town, but for them. She was teaching them not about wealth, but about value, about duty, about legacy. The next day she called Ben. "Tell them both no," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We're not settling. We're going to honor the keeper's will. We're going to create the foundation." The gauntlet had been thrown. The battle lines were drawn. There would be no retreat. The refusal of the settlement offers was an act of war. Within a week, the legal storm broke. Genevieve Thorne, true to her word, filed a barrage of motions in county court. She sought an immediate injunction to remove Alani from the property, an order to seize the contents of the vault, and a declaratory judgment naming her clients as the sole legal heirs of the Blackwood estate. Simultaneously, the city's legal department filed its own claim, asserting that the sale for $1 was voidable due to a mutual mistake of fact, namely, the existence of the fortune, and that all contents belonged to the municipality. Alani found herself at the center of a three-way legal battle, portrayed in court filings as a manipulative opportunist by Thorne and as an incompetent squatter by the city. Her life, once defined by quiet desperation, was now a public spectacle. The local news picked up the story, first as a curious human interest piece about the Lighthouse heiress, then as a full-blown media circus. Reporters began to gather at the end of the track leading to the lighthouse, their long camera lenses pointed at her home. Her isolation was shattered, replaced by a constant, invasive scrutiny. She became a prisoner in her own sanctuary, forced to keep the twins inside, away from the prying eyes and the constant hum of media vans. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish the fragile flame of her resolve. There were days she would hide in the watchroom, staring out at the sea, and wonder if she had made a catastrophic mistake. The simple, secure life she had been offered felt like a paradise lost. But every time she felt herself begin to break, she would be bolstered by her small, dedicated team. Ben Carter was a whirlwind of legal activity, filing countermotions, challenging jurisdictions, and burying the opposition in requests for discovery. He was a brilliant tactician, using the complexity of the case to slow the process down, buying them precious time. His strategy was to prevent a swift summary judgment and force the case to a full trial, where they could present their moral argument to a jury. Elias Vance became her shield against the world. He acted as the gatekeeper, dealing with the press with a gruff, coastal wisdom that disarmed them. He would stand at the end of the track, his weathered face a mask of implacable resolve, and answer their questions with cryptic, folksy statements that gave them nothing of substance but made for interesting television. "The light belongs to the coast," he'd say. "Always has, always will." He also became the voice of their cause in the community. He spoke at town hall meetings in the general store on the docks. He shared the stories of Isaiah Blackwood's secret generosity, producing affidavits from the descendants of families the keeper had saved. He framed the legal battle not as a fight over money, but as a fight for the soul of their community against predatory outsiders, both the city and the distant heirs. Public opinion in Port Blossom and the surrounding coastal towns began to shift, slowly but surely, in Alani's favor. People saw her not as a greedy interloper, but as one of their own, a guardian standing against the forces that had neglected and exploited them for decades. They began to leave supplies for her at the end of the track. Bags of groceries, firewood, books for the children. Small acts of solidarity that meant more to Alani than any legal victory. The most critical step in their strategy was to formalize Alani's intent. With Ben's guidance, she used a small, carefully documented portion of the vault's assets, a single stack of old but still valid gold-backed certificates, to legally establish the Solitude Point Foundation. The foundation's charter, which Ben drafted with meticulous care, mirrored the language of Isaiah Blackwood's letter perfectly. Its stated purpose was to use the assets held in trust to preserve the coastline, support the local community through grants and educational scholarships, and maintain the lighthouse as a historical landmark, open to the public. It was a masterful legal and public relations move. Alani was no longer just an individual fighting for a windfall. She was the director of a charitable foundation, acting as a fiduciary for a stated public good. She had seized the moral high ground. The announcement of the foundation's creation, made by Ben at a press conference on the steps of the Port Blossom Town Hall with Elias at his side, changed the entire narrative. The story went national. Alani became a folk hero to some, a symbol of defiance against greed and bureaucracy. To others, she was a clever thief, wrapping her actions in the noble cloak of charity. The pressure on the city and the Blackwood heirs intensified. They were no longer just fighting a lone woman. They were fighting a foundation with a noble purpose and growing public support. Genevieve Thorne, in a televised interview, called it a sham, a desperate attempt to launder stolen assets. The city's lawyers claimed it was an illegal appropriation of public funds, but the narrative had been set. The court battles dragged on for months. A grueling war of attrition fought in depositions, hearings, and endless paper filings. Alani had to give a deposition, a terrifying ordeal where she spent 2 days in a sterile conference room being cross-examined by Thorne and the city's lead counsel. They picked apart her life, her history of poverty, her motivations. They tried to paint her as unstable, manipulative, and untrustworthy. Through it all, she clung to the simple truth. She told the story of her desperation, the discovery, and the profound impact of Blackwood's letter. She spoke not of her right to the money, but of her duty to honor the keeper's will. Her quiet sincerity was a stark contrast to the aggressive cynicism of the opposing lawyers. During a break in the deposition, Genevieve Thorne approached her in the hallway. The lawyer's polished confidence was gone, replaced by a look of genuine, grudging respect. "I don't understand you," Thorne said, her voice low. "I offered you a life without struggle. The city offered you the same. Why choose this? Why choose this fight you will almost certainly lose?" Alani looked at the powerful, expensive lawyer and saw, perhaps for the first time, a flicker of her own past exhaustion. "Because my children are watching," Alani said simply, "and I want them to know that some things are not for sale." The answer seemed to land with unexpected force. Thorne said nothing more, but the tone of her questioning for the rest of the deposition had subtly shifted. The personal attacks lessened, replaced by a more procedural, less venomous line of inquiry. Alani had not won her over, but she had earned her respect. As she left the law office that day and drove back toward the coast, back toward her tower of iron and light, she felt a profound sense of peace. Win or lose, she had made her stand. She had chosen her path. She had kept the faith. The outcome was now in the hands of the law, but her own integrity was secure. She was the keeper, and she would not be moved. The transition from legal skirmishes to a full-blown jury trial marked the final, decisive chapter of the battle for Solitude Point. The case, the estate of Blackwood versus Freeman v. City of Port Blossom, became a statewide sensation. The small, historic county courthouse was flooded with media, legal scholars, and curious members of the public. Alani felt a sense of profound unreality sitting at the defendant's table next to Ben, with Elias and a few supportive townspeople in the gallery behind them. Across the aisle sat the polished legal team of Genevieve Thorne, with her clients, the Blackwood descendants, a quiet, nervous-looking couple who seemed utterly overwhelmed by the proceedings. At another table sat the city's lawyers, a phalanx of gray suits and stern faces. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, a grueling, emotionally draining ordeal. The city's lawyers argued first, presenting a dry, technical case based on property law and municipal codes. They portrayed the Lighthouse as a city asset, its contents as abandoned property, and Alani as a trespasser who had stumbled upon a public windfall. They were efficient, professional, and utterly devoid of passion. Then came Genevieve Thorne. She was a master storyteller, painting a compelling picture of family, blood right, and inheritance. She brought the Blackwood descendants to the stand, where they spoke of their humble lives and their shock at discovering their connection to a secret fortune. Thorne argued that Isaiah Blackwood, an eccentric and paranoid man, had hidden his wealth for his family, and that Alani was simply a stranger who had intercepted a legacy meant for them. Her closing argument was powerful, appealing to the jury's fundamental belief in the sanctity of family. Finally, it was Ben Carter's turn. He had the weakest case in terms of legal precedent, but the strongest in terms of moral and emotional power. His strategy was to put Isaiah Blackwood himself on trial, to make him the central character in the drama. He began by calling Elias Vance to the stand. Elias, in his simple, honest way, told the story of his grandfather and the keeper. He recounted the tales of Blackwood's secret charity, his deep love for the coast, and his profound sense of duty. He read passages from the logbook, his voice filling the courtroom with the keeper's quiet, stoic words. Ben then called a series of elderly witnesses from Port Blossom, men and women whose parents and grandparents had been direct beneficiaries of Blackwood's anonymous gifts. They told stories of mortgages paid, doctors' bills settled, and fishing boats replaced, all thanks to a mysterious benefactor they now knew to be the lonely man in the lighthouse. Through their testimony, Ben built a powerful, undeniable portrait of Blackwood's character and his lifelong intent. He was not a man who hoarded for his family. He was a man who gave for his community. The centerpiece of Ben's case was Alani herself. On the witness stand, she was quiet, composed, and unshakable. Ben had her tell her story, from the eviction and living in her car to the moment she read Blackwood's letter in the lamp room. She didn't speak like someone claiming a prize. She spoke like someone who had been entrusted with a sacred duty. The opposing lawyers cross-examined her for a full day, trying to trip her up, to paint her as a liar, to expose some hidden greedy motive. But her story never wavered because it was the truth. Her finest moment came under a withering cross-examination from Thorne. "So, Miss Freeman," Thorne said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "you, a woman with nothing, want this jury to believe that you turned down millions of dollars, a life of ease, simply to honor the wishes of a dead man you never met?" Alani looked directly at the jury, her gaze clear and steady. "I didn't turn down money," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "I accepted a job, the job of keeper. That job is more valuable than any amount of money, because it's about protecting something for everyone. It's a job I want my children to be proud I took." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. In that moment, the case was won. Ben Carter's closing argument was a masterpiece of quiet passion. He didn't cite obscure laws. He spoke about trust, duty, and the idea of a legacy that transcends bloodlines. He held up Blackwood's letter. "This," he said to the jury, "is not just a piece of paper. It is a man's soul. Isaiah Blackwood spent his life tending a light to guide strangers safely home. With this fortune, and with this letter, he built a second light, a beacon of hope, meant to guide his community safely through the storms of the future. The law has a word for this. It's called intent. Alani Freeman is not trying to take this fortune. She is trying to protect it. She is honoring the keeper's intent. She is keeping the light burning." The jury deliberated for 2 days. They were the longest 2 days of Alani's life. She waited at the lighthouse, unable to eat or sleep, watching the endless rhythm of the waves and praying. The call came from Ben on the 3rd morning. The jury had reached a verdict. She returned to the courthouse, her heart pounding with every step. The foreman, a woman with a kind, serious face, stood and delivered the verdict. On the city's claim, they found for the defendant, Alani Freeman. On the Blackwood estate's claim, they found for the defendant, Alani Freeman. They legally affirmed the validity of the Solitude Point Foundation and recognized Alani as its lawful director, entrusted to carry out the mission laid out in Isaiah Blackwood's letter. A wave of gasps and then applause swept through the gallery. Alani broke down in tears, collapsing into Ben's embrace. Elias put a steadying hand on her shoulder, his own eyes wet with relief. After the courtroom cleared, as Alani, Ben, and Elias stood on the courthouse steps, Genevieve Thorne approached them. She extended her hand to Alani. "Congratulations, Miss Freeman," she said, her voice sincere. "You were the better keeper." She then turned to Ben. "That was the finest closing argument I've ever witnessed. If you ever decide you want to work for a firm that can afford to pay you what you're worth, call me." She gave a small, wry smile and walked away. The fight was over. The victory was absolute. But as Alani looked out from the steps at the waiting cameras and the cheering townspeople, she felt not a sense of triumph, but the immense, sobering weight of the work that was just beginning. The years that followed the trial were not an end to the story, but the beginning of its true purpose. The Solitude Point Foundation, with Alani as its quiet, steadfast director, became the new light for the coast. The transformation was slow, deliberate, and profound, mirroring the patient, long-term vision of its original founder. Alani did not move away. She did not build a mansion. The lighthouse remained her home, and her life remained one of simplicity and purpose. The keeper's cottage was modestly renovated to be a comfortable, warm home for her and the twins, but the tower itself was her true office. With Elias as her chief advisor and Ben Carter as the foundation's legal counsel, she began the painstaking work of putting Isaiah Blackwood's fortune to its intended use. The first project was the lighthouse itself. Using a team of historical restoration experts, The foundation funded a complete, museum-quality restoration of Solitude Point. The iron was stripped and treated, the brickwork repointed, the magnificent Fresnel lens, which had been located in a dusty warehouse in the state capital, was repurchased and reinstalled. On the one-year anniversary of the verdict, in a ceremony attended by the entire town, Alani, Kai, and Luna threw the switch. For the first time in over 70 years, the great light of Solitude Point swept across the dark water, its powerful, rhythmic beam a symbol of rebirth and enduring hope. The tower was open to the public, with a small museum at its base detailing the life of Isaiah Blackwood and the history of the coast. It became a landmark, a source of pride and a gentle stream of tourist revenue for the town. The foundation's work then turned to Port Blossom and the other struggling coastal communities. It did not simply hand out money. Following Blackwood's own principles, it made strategic investments. It established a low-interest loan program for the local fishing fleet, allowing them to upgrade their boats and equipment to compete with larger, corporate operations. It funded a marine biology research center in partnership with the state university to study and protect the fragile coastal ecosystem. It created the Blackwood Scholarship Fund, a permanent endowment that guaranteed every child who graduated from the local high school could afford to go to college or trade school. The changes were not immediate, but over time, the coast began to heal. Young people who had left to find work in the cities began to return, opening small businesses, starting families. The boarded-up storefronts in Port Blossom were replaced by new shops, a bookstore, a small cafe. The town, once fading into obscurity, found a new, sustainable vitality. Alani herself remained a private figure, shunning the media spotlight that tried to follow her. She found her joy not in the grand announcements or the public ceremonies, but in the small, quiet moments. She found it in watching a new fishing boat, funded by a foundation loan, head out for its maiden voyage. She found it in receiving a postcard from a scholarship student, the first in her family to attend university. She found it in the evenings, sitting with Kai and Luna in the watchroom, helping them with their homework as the great light swept silently over their heads. Her children grew up in the shadow of the lighthouse, but its legacy was their birthright. They learned not about wealth but about stewardship. They spent their summers working on restoration projects, their weekends volunteering at community events. They understood that the fortune was not theirs, but that the responsibility to protect it one day would be. One evening, many years later, Alani stood on the lantern gallery with Elias, now a frail but still sharp-witted old man. They watched the sunset paint the sky, the light beam beginning its nightly vigil. Down below on the shore, her children, now young adults, were walking along the water's edge, talking and laughing. "He would be proud, you know," Elias said quietly, his gaze on the horizon. "Isaiah. He chose well. I just tried to follow the instructions he left," Alani said, a humble truth she had clung to for years. "Ah, but the letter didn't tell you how," Elias countered, a twinkle in his eye. "It only told you why. The how. That was all you. You did more than just manage his money. You understood his heart." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, the wind and the sea their only companions. The world had changed. The coast was thriving. Her children were happy and kind. The light was burning brightly. Alani looked at the endless expanse of the ocean, the same view that had once represented her own isolation and despair. Now she saw something different. She saw connection. She saw promise. She saw a future secured not by money, but by purpose. She had been sold a ruin for $1. She had been given a burden that felt too heavy to bear. But in accepting that burden, in choosing duty over comfort, she had found not a fortune, but something far more valuable. She had found a home. She had found a legacy. And in the heart of the storm, she had become the light. The beam swept past them, a blade of pure white cutting through the gathering dusk, and headed out to sea, a promise to all who were lost in the darkness that a safe harbor was waiting, and that a keeper was on watch.